Yeah, thank you very much. My presentation is starting where Helverian's presentation ended in some way, so I think it's rather complementary than a substitute, which it couldn't be. In any ways, I thought it may be not a bad idea to talk a little bit about the Google case, or the Google cases, to be more precise, that have been around. And on the first slide, I just listed basically the various allegations that have been made against Google, either now in the statement of objections by the Commission, or in the literature, or in the popular press, or also sometimes in some blogs. And not all of these allegations have been taken up by the Commission or the Federal Trade Commission 2 years ago, but they are flying around, basically. So the fat ones are the ones that have been taken up by the European Commission. The most important ones are probably that organic search results are biased, so that Google's own content, YouTube, Google Maps, Google Travel, Google Shopping, are favored in some way or the other. The second one is that Google Shopping, as Helverian just showed, has shown, is somehow advertised too heavily or too prominently. As you say, the back cover of the journal is somehow reserved to Google, and the question emerges whether that basically means that Google can use its position in the general search market. Come to that in a second, whether such a market exists at all, a general search market. Can be used to leverage the market power into Google Shopping, even though Google may not have a dominant position in comparison shopping sites at the moment. Related allegations have been that Google is, however you call it, a gatekeeper, essential facility, bottleneck, or as a statement of objection says, unavoidable trading partner, and whether there's a question of linkage dominance, basically the question being, do people who want to sell running shoes, for example, need to advertise on Google, or do they need Google to sell their running shoes, even if they don't advertise there, as somebody who lists them organically? So, and the question there is, or the debate is, that is arising, that apparently you need to be very prominently linked on Google, otherwise you may not be able to sell. So that's the allegation, at least. Some other forms are that the original search data, I think Hel implicitly touched on that by mentioning how much data is already available to Bing, is not accessible in some possibly anonymized form to competitors. And there's of course the question, are there scale economies as a barrier to entry? How important are these scale economies? Where is the point where the marginal utility of analyzing a further piece of data exceeding or not exceeding the additional cost of analyzing the data anymore? Another point, Google makes it difficult for other search engines to access or index Google content, for example, YouTube or Google Books. And the question is, can Bing be as good in indexing products that have been indexed by Google in the past? Are vertical search engines somehow displaced by Google showing content of vertical search or specialized search engines? Are there barriers against multi-homing of advertising clients? That is also basically something that was resolved by and large by the Federal Trade Commission in January 2013, and then a separate case that the European Commission has taken right now, whether Google products are used as a default on various devices, whether that in combination with Android also serves as a barrier to entry for other products, basically a case or scenario that is very similar to the Internet Explorer cases that we have seen with Microsoft in the past. What can we say about these various allegations? First of all, the European Commission is claiming that Google has a dominant position. You can already read it in the press release, saying that's a quotation from the press release. Google has a dominant position in providing general online search services throughout the European Economic Area, with market shares more than 90% in most European Economic Area countries. And these are not the data, this is not the data actually from the statement of objections, but if you compare it, it's really quite similar, even though this data is, I think, a little bit older, and it's really in Germany, the UK, France, and other countries, which I haven't listed, of the European Economic Area, Google has a market share of 90%. Of course, the question emerges, how is this market share calculated? It's not very easy to disentangle this. My suspicion is somehow that a number of competitors have been predefined. Google, Yahoo, Bing, and Baidu, and Yandex in Russia, and then the number of clicks or unique impressions has been counted in order to calculate market shares. So we don't have the typical proceeding that you ask yourself in the market definition case, where do consumers or users substitute to? Where do they move to if somebody changes the conditions of offer, for example, increases the price or reduces the quality or something? What do consumers do next or users do next? But here rather the approach seems to be, I predefine the number of competitors and then calculate market shares. And I think this is one of the core questions that is so difficult about the case. If we think about what is the correct market definition in which search engines are active. Of course, we all know it's a two-sided market. They are active in the online advertising market, and then we can properly discuss whether search advertising is different from other online advertising. And I think this seems to be handleable, or this seems to be manageable at all, because there are prices being paid, so you can, at least in theory, analyze how advertisers substitute from one form of advertising to some other form of advertising. What is much more difficult, of course, is what users do on the side of the market where they don't pay anything in monetary terms. So we know that users or web pages, typically, or at least for part of the business that they do, don't have to pay for general search. They don't have to pay to use Google or to be listed in Google. And then, of course, the question emerges, how do consumers or web pages theoretically move away? Is there something like a general search market that the European Commission has defined? If we think about other markets, let's say hospitals or retailing, we often think it makes sense to define markets in terms of the product range that is offered, because there are reasonable switching costs, and once a consumer is in a supermarket or is in a hospital, he doesn't move away even if he wants to buy something in addition or purchase something on top of it. So basically we define markets in terms of the product range because we think that there's a tendency to one-stop shopping or one-stop treatment maybe in the hospital, so that we think it makes sense. Even so, you clearly don't substitute one product against the other. We rather think of them as complements. With Google, it's rather less clear, in my view, whether we should also define the market in terms of a product range. Let's say if I search for a book, for example, many people may go to Google, but many more people may actually go to Amazon to search for a book. If I look for a particular person, I may go to Google, but some people may go to LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever they may go to look for somebody. If I search for a particular pair of running shoes, or just running shoes in general, I may possibly use eBay or Amazon as a search engine, and just to compare various running shoes, and not go to Google altogether. So the question is, of course, well, is there something, if you think that consumers typically have some specific query, some specific that they want to know, do they really use Google, or do they use, well, often they use Google, but sometimes they may use quite different web pages which we don't consider search engines traditionally. So we may think, so then of course the question is Amazon also a search engine? Is eBay a search engine? Is in the Internet Movie Database, is Wikipedia, others all search engines? And of course we say, okay, they don't offer the entire range that Google offers, and this is, I think, perfectly true. But if we really think that the market should not be defined by product ranges, because people in the internet can much easier switch away. They can say, okay, and now I'm looking for running shoes and go to Google, and then I look for a book and go to Amazon. Then, of course, the tendency, or let's say one-stop search, is much less attractive proposition than one-stop shopping or one-stop treatment in the hospital sector. So it's not entirely clear that the definition should be for general search, or at least I'm missing some of the studies of consumer behavior, at least in the analysis of the European Commission, which would be highly interesting to strengthen the case that the Commission thinks it has. There's also the impression, if you go through the statement of objections, actually that the Commission is of the view that people search for web pages, because if they distinguish between different forms of the market delineation, they talk about, well, there's general search and then there are content sites, and the argument is they are not in the same, operating in the same market. Why? Because the general search engines link you to web pages, while content sites give you information. And then, of course, the question comes, well, what do people really look for? Do they search for web pages or do they look for information that they want to have? If you think they are rather looking for information, then I think the argument becomes rather that they are probably in the same market. If we think they look for web pages and want to find a particular web page, then, of course, you would say content sites are not in the same market as Google, because they don't give you a link to a particular web page. And in general, I can say the Commission focuses quite heavily on technical aspects. For example, how do the particular search algorithms work? How does the indexing work? Where do they link you to in the finally, rather than the consumer behavior? Where would consumers switch to if Google would change its conditions? The problem, of course, is that the snip test is very difficult to apply in this market. While in theory, I mean, there are very nice papers by Philly Strucki and others. We can say in theory we can, of course, use it. But in practice, if people don't pay for a particular service, I find it quite difficult to think about how to implement a particular snip test in a market where you don't pay on one side of the market. Of course, we could think about, okay, where they pay with the data. So we can think about what would happen if data requirements increase by 5 to 10%. But what does it mean? Data requirements are, so the data that Google wants to have is increased by 5 to 10%. We probably cannot measure it in bits or something. That doesn't make sense. And 5 to 10% might be quite different for different people because they have quite different attitudes to data. We could think about, okay, they increase the advertising as the hedonic price on the page by 5 to 10%. That may be something that could be implemented. Then we could think about how people would probably switch to other web pages. Unfortunately, I haven't seen much of this analysis here yet. Apart from the market for online search, and the Commission goes on and asks, well, there's a market for comparison shopping services, arguing that comparison shopping services do not compete with specialized search services. They do not compete with online retailers and not with merchant platforms or marketplaces. And some of you may, all of this is based basically on the technicalities or the functioning of the various places. For example, that you cannot buy stuff directly through Google Shopping, while you can buy stuff directly at marketplaces. Of course, this is more a technical view and not a consumer-oriented view. And the question is then, is this really, what would happen, for example, as we discussed before, if Google implements a button, direct purchase, right now, would that mean that the market, that Google is not active anymore in the market for comparison shopping sites, and now Amazon has become a big competitor of Google, and Google is not dominant in that particular part of the market anymore? If you look, this is something from the Google blog that was, I think, directly after the statement of objection was handed out to Google. I think a few hours later appeared on the webpage. This is for Germany. If you think here, the somewhat thicker blue line is Google Shopping. This is eBay and Amazon in Germany, and you can see unique visitors to these pages. And then, of course, it becomes very difficult, I think, to argue that there's really a lot of market power yet, at least in Google Shopping, unless, and the argument must be that there is market power in online, in general, online search that is leveraged then into this market, and there I think it's difficult to define the market for online search. Is this placing very effective advertisements for Google Shopping abusive? I'm not entirely sure, because the question, of course, becomes what is the consumer's view here? If consumers think this is not advertising for some reason, but they may think these are organic search results, then, of course, there may be an issue that you think there may be an abuse in the sense that consumers are misled. Is Google Shopping an essential facility or bottleneck? Well, given these impressions here, if you want to sell running shoes and you can sell them on eBay and Amazon, which have much more visitors, I'm skeptical that Google is an essential facility. A question that I haven't really come around to find a very good answer, even though I very briefly discussed this last night with you, John. Why has the European Commission picked Google Shopping as its showcase against Google, given that the market definition is so difficult in this particular case? It's rather unclear whether that's really abusive behavior. And of course, now one can speculate whether they didn't have a better case or whether they were also hoped to saying, well, if we really win this rather weak case, then we are very happy about everything else that we can do in the future. Two more slides. The broader question really that has driven much of the public debate against Google is, does Google bias generic search results? And of course, from the outside, this is very, very difficult to determine, because of course, the nature of a search engine is that it produces a list and doesn't throw up search results stochastically. So there must be some order of something, and the question then is, how can we from the outside determine whether Google content gets preferential treatment, given that search becomes more and more individualized at the same time. But at least my conjecture is that at the margin, Google should have an incentive to favor its own content or web page. In a similar way, we can say like a used car dealer doesn't have the full incentive to tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Of course, this incentive would disappear, as has been argued in part of the literature, if reputation is at stake, and people would immediately recognize that Google is biasing. But this, of course, is a question about consumer perception and the sort of intelligence of consumers, how fast they really realize that there may be a bias. And if there are sufficiently many consumers who don't realize that there may be a bias, then I would conjecture that there is the incentive to at least at the margin bias the results in favor of Google content. Of course, that should be true, as with car dealers, not only for search engines that have market power, but for any search engine that operates its own content. So it should be equally true for Bing and for Yahoo. And in principle, one may even argue that a larger search engine may have a weaker incentive to bias its search results. Why? Because, well, the interest of the general public or the media should be much higher in reporting biases in large search engines than reporting biases in a search engine that nobody uses. So if Google knows that it's under higher scrutiny than a very small search engine, then one could argue that the incentive to bias should actually be lower the larger you are. If, now given the world as it is, and given the case that we have, what could be potential remedies in the case that we have at hand in Europe? Well, one, last slide, I'm almost done. The last, one that the Commission is discussing or has been discussed already under Commissioner Almunia is the requirement to display other comparison shopping sites, online marketplaces in the same way as Google Shopping. So I don't know how many pictures it were, 8 or 5 running shoes that you have shown. Then 1 or 2 would be reserved for others, for example, for my personal price comparison site, if I operate one, or for others. The question, of course, who gets access to this shopping site? Should this be by auction, as Google has once suggested, which was not acceptable for its competitors? Should be by some other mechanism? If it's some other mechanism than an auction, can I start my Justus Haucap price comparison search engine and have free access to Google in a very prominent corner of the web page, or do we need some regulatory body that then determines the equal quality of search results or something? So I think this will be something that is very burdensome and difficult to establish. Well, the German Minister of Economics, you may remember or you may have heard of, has required Google to sell YouTube, etc., to vertically separate, saying Google is only allowed to provide the general search engine, but no own content. So that means if you look for stock price IBM, Google would not be allowed to show you the stock price. If you look for weather in Rome, Google would not be allowed to show you the weather in Rome. They would only allow to show you links to web pages. So that is probably the idea, that people look for web pages and not for information. And that is a particular view of the world, which may be true or not. But if you think that people look for information, then it's probably not such a good idea, because it will stifle innovation. Of course, you can ask the question, the next, is Amazon dominant in the market for book searches, for example? Because my suspicion is that many people look for books on Amazon. And then, of course, we should require Amazon not to sell books anymore, but just to provide links to other booksellers who sell the books.
And they should provide links to other booksellers.
Exactly. So I think this is a very peculiar way. Should we have access to anonymized historical data? Search neutrality has been discussed. I find this utterly difficult to determine what search neutrality exactly means. We have difficulties with net neutrality already. What search neutrality means seems to me very, very difficult to define. Should we have the great search regulator of all 28 European countries and an American, Australian, and some others, who approves Google's 900 changes of search algorithms per year? Probably not such a bad idea. I think the best would be to have maybe some increased transparency. If this is not transparent enough, make an even more yellow or bigger ad sign towards shopping, depending on consumer behavior, and maybe establish something like an independent ombudsperson who could solve disputes about potentially allegations of search biases. I skip the conclusions and thank for your attention.